So, welcome to the Module 3, the key trends of air freight transport. In many ways, those first couple of lectures that we've had are more about laying a foundation for the rest of the semester. In the first lecture, we were identifying some of the key organisations involved in air cargo. We're also talking about some of the statistics, some of the data in regards to the aviation industry and where air cargo is placed in that particular aviation industry. I provided some definitions of key terms that we'll be using through the term itself. I also introduced you to the 6 main carriers of air cargo that we'll follow through the course of the semester. I spent some time discussing the viability of air cargo and introduced air cargo as a multimodal type of service, primarily because it's located at the airport and the service occurs there, and it's multimodal because it needs a connection of some form of one of the other modes, whether it's truck, train or sea. And I finished off by using Australia as a little bit of a case study in terms of its own profile for air cargo and spoke about the various exports and import profile of Australia in regards to air cargo. Last week was really providing some historical perspective in terms of air cargo and the aviation industry generally. And I finished off by a relatively detailed discussion about how the conventions have influenced the standards, the rules, the regulations for the air cargo industry and established some form of uniformity for aviation as we know it today. And finished off with the freedoms of the air and how those freedoms of the air have been accepted, if you like, by various countries. So today I want to build on that information and talk about the key trends in air freight transport. This particular lecture will segue very nicely with the next lecture. In the next lecture I'm going to talk in some detail about the type of products that are typically found in air freight transport and have a go at placing them into groups, segmenting them if you like, similar to what we did today in our tutorial example. Excuse me. Our focus questions for today are: what are the key trends in both international and domestic air cargo traffic? What are the main international trade routes? And what is the role of hubs in the flow of international and domestic air freight? Our readings this week mainly come from Morrell, and they're covered in Chapter 1, pages 1 to 24. I added in an additional reading there just in case you wanted to look in a little bit more detail. You've got the option to do that. And also there's a reading there by Boeing, which is talking about the forecast for air cargo over a period of time. This first slide that I want to introduce is the passenger versus freight traffic trends between 2005 and 2016. The passengers can be seen in the stripe bar, and the freight tonnes per kilometres can be seen on the dark bar. Now, this is quite an intuitive table as it reflects on air cargo and the challenges that air cargo have as an industry itself. And what you can see from this particular table is the variable movement of growth rates of air cargo over that 10-year period. No 2 years are the same. it's almost a boom or bust. In regards to the passenger kilometres, you can see a level of consistency right through that 10-year period. But with freight tonnes per kilometres, you've got some quite high rates there, and you've got some quite negative rates of growth. What that tells us, what that translates into, is a percentage growth of air cargo over that period of around about 3.7%. Now, if you compare that to passenger, that comes in at around about 6.2% over around about that, excuse me, same period. Some of the other takeouts from this particular slide are that as a lead up to the global financial crisis, you can note there that in 2006, the growth rate for air cargo was over 15%. So it was performing really well, as was passenger growth rates at that particular point in time. Where the big change came as we led into the global financial crisis, which at its height was in 2009, air cargo was already sliding in 2007. In 2008 it had gone into a negative, and in 2009 it was almost 10% in negative growth. When you compare that to passengers, you can see that the passenger numbers is a lot more resilient. It was able to hold on to a significant amount of growth over that time. What we've found is that over time, air cargo has been affected quite considerably by the economic climate at the time. And as we lead into a recession, you will often find air cargo is affected first and quite considerably as a lead into that particular recession. So as you can see there, it's gone from over 15, it's then gone to around about 5, then it's gone into a negative, and then it's almost 10% down in terms of growth rate. Now, coming out of the recession, you can note there that in 2010 we had a significant rise in air cargo, certainly a lot more than passenger. And the main reason for that is the replenishment of inventories in a number of markets that were depressed over that time of the global financial crisis. Now, at that point in time, I guess everybody was feeling quite positive on the idea that the growth rates of air cargo was going to continue quite well over the next 5 or 6 years. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. And if you have a look at the growth rates at that particular period, they were quite depressed for air cargo. In fact, passenger growth recovered a lot more than air cargo, and that's probably reflective of, I suppose, the depressed nature of a number of the key markets that move air cargo. Over that period of time, the percentage growth in air cargo from 2010 to 2016 has been around about 2%, and that's contributed to that overall 3.7% growth rate. The next trend I want to have a look at is air freight distance. And I want to look at the difference between international freight and domestic freight. Now, in Lecture 1, I introduced freight tonnes per kilometre as the accepted measure of air freight because it captures both weight and distance. So it's ideal to use for looking at distances. A little bit later on, we'll have a look at airports, and typically they use tonnes throughput at the airports. So what we know is freight tonnes per kilometre is 1 metric tonne of revenue load carried 1 kilometre. Now, the average distance per tonne of international freight carried has remained constant for a relatively long period of time, and it sits at over 5,000 kilometres, so between 5,100 and 5,600 kilometres. And if you think about it, we're talking about international flights, so it reflects the nature of these long-haul movements, and that is particularly between Asia and Europe and Asia and North America. In terms of volumes, international freight traffic sits at about 84% of all cargo that's carried around the globe is internationally carried. Conversely, if we have a look at domestic freight and the distances carried in domestic freight, as you would expect, the distances are much shorter. Just a little bit over 1,000 kilometres is the average distance of domestic freight carried. And domestic freight traffic sits at around 16%. So 84% carried internationally, 16% carried domestically, and the majority of domestic air cargo is carried in the United States. I now want to have a look at the trend of air mail, international versus domestic growth. International mail revenue based on revenue tonnes per kilometre has changed significantly over the years, as you would expect. So if we think back to those early days of aviation, the main goods that were carried, or the main cargo that was carried on freighter aircraft, or any aircraft really, was going to be air mail. So in 1938, the percentage of air mail carried was 70% of all goods carried in cargo. 30 years later, that had dropped down to 21%. And that's reflected by the nature of the increase of other goods being carried, the air freight that was being carried. In 2008, it was down to about 2.5%. And in 2016, it was 2.2%. So it sits at about 2.2%, bearing in mind that the air cargo market has certainly expanded a lot over those particular years. Now, air mail traffic volumes have typically increased volumes, are due to increased volumes of freight, as I mentioned before. And also the success of the integrator. Now, the integrators, the express carriers, many of those have contracts to carry mail, so when they do the calculation about the carriage of mail, often it's put in with the cargo side of things. From a domestic perspective, it's been performing better than international, and it sits at about 6.7%. And in fact, that is an increase from 2008, which was 5.3%. We're now going to look at air freight versus air mail growth. And from an international perspective, looking at freight tonnes per kilometres in the dark bar and the mail tonnes per kilometres in the striped bar, what this tells us is that over this period, I already mentioned that air freight had been increasing on average over that period at 3.7%. Mail has actually performed even a little bit better at about 4.4%. Now, mail has also not been immune to downturns in the economy, but not to the extent that we see with air freight. So it's impacted, but not to that same level. So you can see in 2009, where air freight had a negative growth of almost 10%, mail had a negative growth rate of around about 1%. So it's been very resilient over that particular period. And as we come out of the global financial crisis, it's actually gained some considerable growth through that particular period, which has allowed it to have that average rate of around about 4.4. Now, one potential reason why air mail has performed reasonably well over that period is the residual effect of e-commerce. Now, we know that most of the e-commerce traffic carried is by the integrators or the express carriers. However, the post office has still got a viable role for some of that e-commerce that may not have perhaps an urgent delivery, and that might be in regards to the delivery or the return. So that's one argument why air mail has been able to achieve those positive levels that it has. The next couple of slides, I want to look at the trend of cargo goods carried on freighters versus cargo goods carried on passenger aircraft. This has got the international world cargo traffic excuse me, over the period 1999 to 2015. And what this shows us is that freighters account for, in 1999, 43% of all air cargo that was carried, peaking at 52% in 2008, and it currently sits at around about 47%. So 47% of all air cargo that's carried around the globe is carried in a freighter. So 53% is carried in a passenger aircraft. Now, where it, I guess it becomes a little bit interesting is when you have a look at the percentage of all flights that freighters are part of. So if we have a look at those numbers there, what that tells us is that in 1999, 5.6% of all flights were freighters. So about 6% of flights were freighters. It now sits at about 4.4%. So I guess the takeout here is that only 4% of flights moving around the globe carrying cargo are freighters, although they're almost carrying 50% of the volume of air cargo. And this is also reflected in the average tonnes per flight. So what we can see here is that currently sitting at 2015, all cargo flights accounted for around about, on average, 44 tonnes of cargo versus passenger flights, which were carrying, on average, around about 4 tonnes. So 10 times more cargo is carried on a freighter flight versus a passenger flight. And that enables, and that multiplier effect enables all cargo flights to be carrying the vast amount of cargo that it does carry. Now, if we have a excuse me, if we have a look at the cargo weight load factor, and the weight load factor is the percentage of capacity available to carry cargo that's actually used, we see that, and I'll use 2015, but you've got a number of options there. In 2015, 65% of available capacity on freighters was being used, whereas passenger flights only 36%. And some reasons why that might be the case. Passenger flights over time have been impacted by the low-cost carrier. So the low-cost carrier typically have got one focus, and that is on passengers. In many cases, the low-cost carrier won't carry any cargo at all. They'll carry some baggage, but no cargo. So with the volumes of low-cost carriers moving around the globe with unused capacity is reducing that overall weight load factor percentage. And finally, just a quick snapshot of freighter versus passenger, but on a domestic perspective. Using a same time period from 1999 to 2015, what we see there, similar type of evidence. 50 more than the international. In 1999, 56% of all cargo was carried on a freighter aircraft. It now sits at around about 53%. So that's more than's carried on all the flights domestically for passenger aircraft. Passenger aircraft are carrying about 47%. And then when you have a look at the volume of freighters versus passenger aircraft moving cargo, it's even smaller. So 2.5% of freighter aircraft are carrying over 50% of the cargo volume. And then we translate that into a look at the average tonnes per flight, similar type of multiplier effect, but even greater domestic versus freighter. What we can see there in 2015, freighter flights were carrying 29 times more tonnes on their flights than were passenger flights. The weight load factor is also has got a similar variable. In terms of achieving a weight load factor in 2015, air cargo flights were carrying around about 70%. So a very significant weight load factor. Now, what might explain the little bit more extreme scenario in domestic? Part of that is due to the fact that passenger aircraft domestically lack wide-bodied aircraft. The majority of domestic aircraft are narrow-body, so the volumes available for passenger aircraft are going to be lower, as well as the influence of low-cost airlines again, who don't have any interest in cargo at all. Has anybody got any questions in regards to those initial air traffic trends? Okay, so we're going to move away from that, and we're now going to have a look at the major international trade lanes for cargo. So what the objective is here is to get a sense of where the cargo is moving around the globe, what the major centres are, and then we'll have a look at the major carriers as well as the airports. So this particular figure here shows you the percentages of movement of air cargo between regions. So it's what you see here is that the main regions are North America to Asia, Asia to North America. On that particular trade lane, 20% of the world's cargo is carried. If we have a look between Asia and Europe and Asia, almost 20% of all cargo globally is carried on that particular trade lane. And the third one that stands out there is North America to Europe, Europe to North America, around about 10%. So you can see that the Northern Hemisphere controls a lot of the movement of air cargo. In terms of growth of those particular trade lanes, whether it's a short haul or long haul, it's been pretty similar, around about 4.7, 4.4 respectively. Now, I want to look at each of those trade lanes. Each trade lane's got some characteristics that are different than other trade lanes. The first one I wanted to look at was the first one I mentioned, which is the transatlantic. So that's got the highest freight tonnes per kilometre that we can see there. Now, the characteristics on this particular lane, it hasn't changed a lot in terms of its volumes over the last 6 or 8 years, standing at around about 20%. So there hasn't been a lot of change. One thing that is significant about this particular trade lane, has a significant imbalance. 67% more goods moved from Asia to North America than moved from North America to Asia. So there's quite a significant imbalance on that particular trade lane. I guess the challenge with having an imbalance is it makes those carriers, it gives them the challenge of trying to get good yields and high trip returns when that particular situation occurs, particularly when you've got an excess in one direction and a shortage in the other. And of course, the main reason that's driving this is that the demand in North America to Asia is not at the same as Asia to North America. Now, it almost also flows down into some of the countries involved in those two regions. So if you have a look at China and Hong Kong in terms of the cargo that it moves to North America, it's moving twice the volume of cargo that is coming back the other way. And I suppose that might be fueling some of the arguments that the United States has at the moment in regards to China, in regards to the volumes coming out of that particular region. Now, this particular trade lane has got quite significant freighter usage. 75% of all goods are carried on freighters on this particular lane. The second highest, just marginally below the other direction, is Europe to Asia, Asia to Europe. 19.9% in 2016 were carried on this particular route. Some of the characteristics. This particular trade route has taken quite a drop in usage over the last number of years. It peaked at 26 or 27%, if you like, in 2009, and now sits at just under 20. So there's been quite a significant drop in the movement of goods over this particular trading lane. And even more of an imbalance exists on this particular trade lane as the imbalance that exists between Asia and North America. 71% imbalance in favour of Asia. Some countries and city pairs have extreme imbalances. An example would be that Tokyo to Amsterdam are carrying 42% higher flow than in the opposite direction. Some imbalances can vary between carriers. So if we look at the movement between the UK and Tokyo, British Airways have the movement in and out of Japan from the UK is quite similar. However, if you look at Japan Airlines and All Nippon, they're carrying 60% more goods on that particular route than they're bringing back the other way. Perhaps one reason to explain that is to look a little bit deeper into the type of carriers that they are. And British Airways is a passenger carrier, so it doesn't have freighters in its fleet. Both Japan Airlines and Air Nippon are combination carriers, so they have got the opportunity by having freighters in their fleet to carry more cargo, hence the potential for a greater imbalance. According to Boeing, on this particular route, 80% of all cargo is carried by freighter. Transatlantic, so we're talking about North America to Europe, around about 10% of the tonnage of air cargo is carried on that particular route. In terms of volume, that has taken the most significant drop of all these particular trade routes. It's reduced down from 21.4% to 9.8%, so quite a considerable drop over that period of 17 years. In terms of airport export volumes, they're actually quite similar. Not a big imbalance like you see on the other Asia to Europe and Asia to North America. And one of the reasons why there isn't such an imbalance is that if you look at the profile, the manufacturing profile of Europe and the manufacturing profile of North America, you'll see a lot of similarities. And when we talk a little bit deeper about the products that are carried on these particular routes, what you'll notice is the same products carried by air cargo from the United States or North America are the same products coming out of Europe and going to North America. Now, probably as expected, 3 European countries there, Germany, France and the UK, account for 50% of the movement of tonnage along this route, and probably reflects the economic standing of those particular countries. Interestingly, most of the volume that is reduced out of this particular route has been taken up by trade routes either connected to Asia and certainly the emergence of the Middle East as a trade hub. As expected, because it's got a much lower volume of air cargo, according to Boeing, only 40% of the movement of air cargo is by freighter. So the vast majority, 60%, is by passenger aircraft, and most likely to be wide-body passenger aircraft. Intra-Europe is an interesting scenario. Intra-Europe, 28 or so countries, and only 2% of air cargo by volume is carried in that particular region. And I suppose what goes to explain that is the reliance by Europe in many ways on their movement by other modes. So whether it's truck, whether it's canal, whether it's river system, or whether it's rail. Germany stands out as one of the key countries in terms of the movement of manufacturing by air cargo in that particular region. Intra-Asia is an interesting one. That's a region that's growing. That's grown from 7.7% in 1999 to 9.7% in 2016. And most of this is by virtue of the fact of the major trading centres who are interacting with Japan. So Hong Kong, China, Taiwan and the Republic of Korea. The geography and the relative limited infrastructure to move by surface transport limits the use of trucking options in this particular region. The major exception here is Hong Kong. Hong Kong are able to provide a conduit to China, and they have a bonded truck service that services China through 17 destinations. So that is one area where they're able to take advantage of the trucking as an option. Has anybody got any questions about the major international trade lanes? Yep. Okay. The next trend I want to look at is the trend of by region of airline registration. So in terms of where the airlines reside that are carrying the majority of cargo around the globe, Asia stands out as number one. And this is based on this principle that the nationality of an airline still determines the principal place of operation. So, except for some liberalised regions, for example, Europe. So the largest international share is Asia, as I said before. Around about 40% of all cargo moved around the globe is from Asian carriers. Not only do they have a strong trading lane with Europe and North America, they've also got quite a significant movement within Asia itself. And that contributes to that almost 40%. It's led by large cargo operators, Cathay Pacific, Korean Air, Singapore Airlines, and quite a number of other airlines. One of the characteristics of this particular region is that they're all combination carriers. And we have spoken about combination carriers, and what we know about combination carriers is they have got a significant fleet of passenger aircraft, but they also have a fleet of freighters. Now, if we look a little bit more deeper into the individual airlines that make up Asia as a region of airline registration, the top 10 can be seen here. So we've got Cathay Pacific and Korean Air at the top, taking up around about 25% of the volume of their cargo. All of these particular airlines are combination carriers, which is pretty unique when you look at a region, but combination carriers who are carrying cargo. 8 of the top 10 operators are based in countries that have got high-tech products, strong exports of high-tech products. And the only one really to miss out, and I think it's probably a little bit unfair on them, is Japan. And that's mainly because the growth of exports out of Japan have been quite depressed in recent years. So I think you could easily say that all those countries are strong performers in terms of exports of high-tech products. I guess one of the interesting characteristics of this particular lineup here is that 3 Chinese airlines can be found in that top 10. If we went back 7 or 8 years ago, there might be 1 Chinese airline. But what it highlights is the volume and integration of China aviation industry, particularly along those lines of global movement. And it's expected that that share of air cargo can only increase out of China. Internationally, the one that sits behind in second highest international share of region by airline registration from an international perspective is Europe. Almost 30% of the air cargo that's moved around the globe is moved by Europe Airlines, despite the fact that only 2% of intra-Europe movement occurs by air, so quite small. This is led by, similar to Asia, but a little bit different, large freighter operations, Air France, Lufthansa and Cargo Lux. And I guess the difference here is that both the top 3, Air France, KLM and Lufthansa, are combination airlines. In other words, they've got freighters in the fleet. Cargo Lux is just a freighter-only airline. Looking a little bit closer at those airlines, at the top 10 European airlines by airline registration, we see that 36% is carried by 2 airlines, Air France KLM and Lufthansa Cargo, as we can see there. Different from the makeup of the airlines in Asia, we see all cargo airlines in that lineup of the top 10. So we can see Cargo Lux and Airbridge, and they take up 25% of the movement of cargo in that by European airlines. An interesting addition to this lineup is actually Turkish Airlines. Turkish Airlines over the last 10 years has moved from 47th in the globe, in the world, to round about 21st. And that's actually put them into 6th place on this particular top 10 list. Another interesting characteristic of this particular list is the fact that IAG and also Virgin Atlantic Airways are passenger carriers. So they don't have any freighters at all in the fleet. They find themselves in that particular group. And another difference from Asia is the fact that DHL, an integrator, is also in the top 10 of those particular airlines that we see there, despite the fact that Europe has got that strong preference to use truck traffic when it possibly can. The last two I've grouped together internationally. Middle East and North America have got similar international volumes of air cargo internationally. Middle East, around about 16%, and North America, around about 15%. So around about the same. Totally different in their makeup, but around about that same volumes internationally. And I guess one of the big success stories in terms of the movement of air cargo and the location that air cargo is utilising has been Middle Eastern carriers. Over the last 20 years, they've gone from a position of about 4.4% of global cargo to 15.8%. And a lot of this has got to do with its strategic location, which I mentioned before. North America share you might expect to be a little bit higher than it is. It sits at around about 15%. However, much of the reason for that relatively small, I mean it's still a significant volume, is the fact that integrators have very little share of international express and air freight. So the big movers of air cargo in the United States have very little share, and also combination carriers seldom use freighters. And if you looked at the main airlines in the United States, most of them, if you took out the integrators, are going to be passenger carriers, not combination carriers. And these carriers moving from the United States to, or North America to Europe, are able to use their wide bodies to carry as much cargo that they might possibly need. A quick look at the Middle East. What that shows us is that 80% of the volumes in the Middle East can be attributed to 3 airlines. Those airlines are Emirates, Qatar and Etihad. So 80%, another characteristic of that particular region, they're all combination carriers, so they all utilise freighters in their fleet. Etihad has had considerable growth, and they're carrying around about 40% of the cargo that can be attributed to that particular region. And that has almost doubled over the last 6 or 8 years. However, probably the main star in that pack, if you like, is Qatar Airways, operating out of Doha, similar region. They're up almost 30% at the moment, so their share is 30%, and this is up from 13% only 6 or 8 years ago. The main loser in the mix of the countries that we've got there is Saudi Arabian Airlines. They're down about 40% over that similar sort of period, that last 6 or 8 years. Now, domestically, shows a different picture. From a domestic perspective, what you see there is that the United States dominates the movement of air cargo. And 60% of domestic air cargo can be attributed to North American carriers. The other region with a significant amount is Asia, and that's typically driven by the fact that there is a significant amount of domestic usage of air cargo in Japan and also in China. We see Europe once again languishing at almost 3%. So from a domestic perspective, it's that unique nature of Europe relying more on other forms or other modes, if you like, to move their goods around the region. In terms of the overall picture, in terms of region by airline registration, domestic really doesn't have a big impact on where they sit in terms of global volumes. Asia is still pretty well out in front. Europe, a relatively strong second, followed by North America, which has been able to improve their volumes significantly, but relative to the fact that domestic volumes are only 14% of the global air cargo volumes that are carried. Just a few characteristics about the North American market. Obviously, when we're talking about North America, we're talking about two large countries in the main, the USA and Canada, which has got plenty of potential for air carriers. And if we look at the top 10, 50% of the air cargo carried around in the United States is express cargo, and that's carried by the two integrators, FedEx and UPS. And the FedEx and UPS story is quite a unique one because they've really emerged over the last 30 or 40 years by virtue of deregulation in the United States. So when deregulation came around, the integrators emerged and they took advantage of the opportunity presented by a lot of the airlines at the time competing very heavily. So most of the combination carriers, anybody who might have had a freighter in the fleet, were competing very heavily, but they weren't necessarily competing on air cargo, they were competing on passenger. So that left a niche opportunity for these integrators to take advantage of. And so the end result is that they dominate the market, not only on freight tonnes per kilometres, but also on revenue, just on express cargo. I guess the other influence in regards to the opportunity presented to integrators is that most of that competition between the other airlines, who were combination carriers at the time, resulted in the fact that they were moving away, certainly domestically, from wide body to narrow body. Narrow body providing very little opportunity to carry cargo. And as a consequence of that, coming out the other end, you've got the three main passenger airlines in the United States. They don't have freighters, so they're no longer combination carriers. So we can see there Delta, United and American, three of the largest airlines in the world, but they're passenger airlines focusing on passenger rather than having freighters in their fleet. Another interesting characteristic, which I suppose we can see here in the top 10 in this particular region, is that Atlas Air, Polar Air and Southern Air, and Kalita Air, they're all air cargo carriers, so they're all freighter only. So quite significant in that particular market. We're going to shift focus a little bit now, so we're going to move away from getting the goods to the airport. We're going to have a look at the throughput at the airport itself. So we're going to have a look at airport cargo traffic volumes. Now, in the first instance, we're going to look at the combination of both international and domestic tonnes throughput in the top 10 airports in the world. It probably comes as no surprise that the biggest hubs for air cargo is going to be coming from Asia and the United States. If we have a look at that list, we see that Asian airports feature highly. Hong Kong, Shanghai and Seoul right at the top, as well as Tokyo in the mix as well. So 4 Asian hubs are in the top world airports for the volumes of air freight. Integrators, and most of that volume coming out of the United States, are Memphis and Louisville. FedEx operate out of Memphis. UPS operate out of Louisville. An interesting one in the mix is Dubai. Dubai stands out mainly because of its growth over the last 20 years in that particular region. Probably the odd one out is Anchorage, and you wouldn't really call Anchorage a hub. Anchorage is more a refuelling stop or a transit base. So just a little bit, excuse me, different from the other ones. And making up that top 10, we've got a couple of airports out of Europe. Now, if we have a look at Asia in particular, what we know about that is that Asian airports are all combination carrier hubs with a large fleet of freighters. So Hong Kong, Seoul, and this is so moving away from international to domestic. We're just looking at international now. Hong Kong and Seoul, Shanghai, Tokyo, Taipei and Singapore are in the top 10 international hubs in the world. So, which is, if you think back on some of the volumes moving out of Asia and within Asia, it's probably unsurprising that most of the hubs are going to be in Asia. Dubai is quite high on the list. I mean, essentially what you've got here is a list that doesn't include the integrators from Memphis and Louisville. And as I've mentioned before, Dubai finds its way onto the list mainly because of its double-digit growth over a period of time, 90s and the 2000s. And the reason for that is that fact that it's strategically located between the trading lanes of Asian trading lanes, which places it as a really good transshipment location. We've got two European airport hubs in the international tonnes, which are Charles de Gaulle and Frankfurt. They're the only two in that particular list. If we have a look at the hub traffic, so the volumes going through the particular hubs, what this tells us is the top 10 international airports and their hub carriers. So each of the hubs are generally make it into that position because they've got significant throughput of cargo from airlines that locate themselves at those hubs. So the volume going through these top 10 hubs is almost 50% of all the volume of air cargo that moves around the globe. And the majority of these hub-based carriers are either combination carriers or they're either integrators. Now, if we look at Hong Kong, for example, the hub carrier for Hong Kong is Cathay Pacific. For Seoul, it's Korean and Asiana, etc., etc., as you go through. So each of those hubs have got a significant combination carrier who calls that hub their home. So they channel all their cargo into that hub and then out of that hub again. They're the combination carriers. Integrators, you can see Hong Kong, DHL has got its hub there. DHL got a hub at Shanghai. UPS have got a hub. DHL and FedEx. So what makes these hubs work is by having that mix of airlines operating out of that hub. And probably the only one that probably stands out that's a little bit unique in that mix is La Poste. La Poste is actually a post office, but they have a hub located at Charles de Gaulle in France. It's a French post office, as you probably get. One of the important things and why the volumes moving in and out of the hub is studied quite intently by any air cargo airlines is because they need it for to plan their movements in and out of that particular hub. So for an airline that's using the hub, they need to plan the volumes in terms of ground handling facilities, also airport slots for arrival and departure. One of the biggest challenges and knocks or negatives of a hub is the fact that most of those hubs have very few slots for new aircraft arrivals. So that's a critical issue for anybody who's using those hubs. In addition to having the opportunity to move an aircraft into the airport, you also need to have some space for your trucks to enter the landside for the delivery of goods or the departure of those goods. In addition to that, the expectation would be that each of these hubs have significant cargo terminals to allow them to break down shipments and move the goods on. This is an interesting slide in that it gives you a sense of the role that the hub performs in the movement of air cargo. Now, it's based around a traffic breakdown in Amsterdam at a hub airport there. Now, in many ways, a lot of the hub traffic in Europe is carried by truck, but it gives you an interesting mix of what happens at a hub when goods arrive. So what we see here is that goods arriving by air and departing by air transfer of over 35%. So flights coming in, goods moving to another aircraft and moving on happens 35% of the time at the hub. And that's the role that the hub's having. If you remember that hub and spoke idea, flights coming in and then moving out again. So that happens at 35% of the time at this particular airport. Transshipment from air to truck and truck to air is about 46%. So in total, about 80% of the goods coming into the hub are moving on to another destination. And that's the beauty or the benefit of the hub. It's that potential to move cargo in and out. Now, you would expect in another region that the air to truck and truck to air would be much lower because they don't rely so much as they do in Europe in the movement by truck. So that's all I was going to mention about airport throughput and volume. Has anybody got any questions in that regard? Okay. So I just wanted to make a few observations in regards to whether air traffic actually varies within a year. And this particular slide here shows the Hong Kong airport freight tonnes variation over the course, by month, over the course of the year 2014. So if you look at that, it's based on freighters and all flights. Well, first off, you'd say cargo moving on all flights, which are passenger flights, and cargo moving on freighters is about the same. So not a lot of variation in terms of the timing, in terms of the movement of cargo at that particular period of time. So they've got a similar traffic. But what you can observe are a couple of peaks. The first peak, or the major peak if you like, is in October, November, and that's a pre-Christmas peak of movement through Hong Kong Airport. The second peak is in April, notionally around about Easter, but it's more likely a reflection of the fact that there is a significant trough in February, which is because a lot of factories in Asia closed down for the Chinese New Year. So there is some form of variation in terms of international air traffic over the course of a year. Now, if you extrapolate that out over a number of years, this particular slide here gives you the total international air freight tonnes per traffic visitation by month from 2010 to 2016. Now, if you've got in your own mind the graph that we just looked at, you would probably say that this looks pretty similar. So over a 6-year period, most of the movements and variation have been similar to what we saw in Hong Kong. Probably you can see a peak around about that October-November period. You can also see another peak around about that March-April period, and you can also see that trough. Now, beyond that, it all seems to be pretty similar. The only thing I could observe there was that this particular peak here is in 2010, and it might reflect the fact that when I suppose, many markets were coming out of the global financial crisis, there was a significant increase in air cargo. Probably the only example I could find there to find a difference. So I think what we could argue from this is that there's a lot of similarities in the movement of cargo through the year in terms of its peaks and troughs. Yeah. Look, that might be the topic of some little bit of research, but my feeling about that is that over that particular period, and our friends from Norway might confirm, I think we're talking about holidays in Europe. Would that coincide with around about that time? So I think what you find there is that there's a lot of closures, a lot of people go on holidays, certainly a lot more religiously than Australia in different countries at different times of the year, and I think that might coincide with that. And so that little bit of a improvement might be a reflection of, getting back to business, getting the inventories back in more shape, perhaps. If we ask the question, weekly, daily traffic, is there any variation? Well, traffic data indicates that most days of the week are quite similar. So it's pretty hard to be definitive and say, well, that particular day is going to be the busiest day for air cargo. However, there have been some studies over time, one in Europe by Eurocontrol, indicated that Thursdays and Fridays perhaps were the busiest days for air cargo in Europe, with the suggestion that this was linked with a peak driven by getting the goods ready to move off over the weekend or something to that effect. Nothing too definitive. Other studies have indicated that Fridays are busy days and that weekdays are twice as busy as weekend days. So I think the jury's out in regards to whether there's a great deal of variation, but it can depend, and it might just depend on what's happening at the time. As a general rule, it's stated that weekends for the movement of air cargo is generally quieter for freighter activity. However, Europe to a long haul to and from Asia has been known to generate high levels of that average traffic. A number of airlines in Europe might offer services to different types of operators. So Aerologic carries goods for both DHL and also Lufthansa, and during the week it carries most of its air cargo to Asia, and at the weekend it's carrying the air cargo onto the USA. So it just is most likely a case-by-case basis. But if you think about it, you know that there's most likely a greater move to this idea of a just-in-time inventory delivery. You know, I think you could probably put an argument up for the fact that goods might move over the weekend and arrive in the market ready for the next week. But I don't think that's been fully statistically confirmed. Has anybody got any questions about the air cargo traffic variation? Okay. I'm thinking we're coming into the last section now, and it's about capacity. So the trend of capacity. So if we look at short haul and medium haul routes, typically this is a high frequency service for passenger airlines rather than all cargo aircraft. Normal patterns of flight, if you have a look at them for passenger aircraft, for medium to large cities, is most likely going to be built around a schedule of a number of flights in the morning, perhaps peaking at 7 to 9, maybe a midday flight, an evening flight, and on balance, these particular flights on these medium type sectors are not ideal for cargo. Perhaps the evening flight might be an opportunity to provide options to feed long haul flights. For a schedule really to work in favour of, say, an express carrier, you'd have a later evening departure which present an opportunity for next day delivery. Another reason why freighters are not necessarily often used on short haul routes is to run a freighter is quite an expensive undertaking, and perhaps why freighter operators work so hard at getting their percentage of cargo capacity up as high as it possibly can, and that's to make it worthwhile. And particularly these short hauls that might occur at night. However, for integrators, and what we know from integrators is that they typically have a higher yield, which indicates that they're charging more for their product. They're more likely to use those short haul freighters in Europe and North America. For combination carriers, they often are going to substitute surface transport where they possibly can on these short haul legs, particularly in Europe. And in some cases, for these road feeder options such as trucks, they present a really good opportunity because not only do they have a significant payload of 20 tonnes, but also they've got a flexible frequency, so they can depart at any time. Some carriers have even gone to the point of having their own truck hub, where they, British Airways operate a truck hub in the Netherlands, for example. Now, if we look at long haul, it's probably unsurprising that most of the long haul flights are operated on wide-bodied aircraft. They're going to carry 20 tonnes of capacity, and this particularly happens across the North America to Europe. These frequencies are only a few times a week, might be once per day, 3 or 4 times a week at a minimum. The departures themselves often occur at night, and that fits into that schedule of that overnight delivery, particularly for express. When there's a limited passenger demand on these long-haul routes, as there are in a number of particular routes, particularly from Asia, or going to Asia, what you find is that freighters are typically used, and so they're able to take advantage of maximising the opportunities to move those goods into Asia by virtue of a freighter. And if you remember when we looked at the volumes of goods carried by freighter out of Asia to North America, 75% of the flights were all cargo flights or freighter flights, and between Europe and Asia, 80% of those flights are freighters. So long-haul destinations, limited passenger demand presents the opportunity for the freighter. So unsurprisingly, the busiest routes are Europe to Asia, Asia to Europe, Asia to and from North America. The final slide I've got for you today is to give you a sense of the volume that you might find on a long-haul route. Not sure how that looks to you. I'm struggling myself. So I'll explain what that is. That's the passenger freighter flights from Europe to Asia in the month of January. That happens to be the year 2010. I think that doesn't make a great deal of difference. But on those routes, 80% of that air cargo is moved by a freighter, as I said before. On average, around about 42 freighter flights are occurring per day, and the majority of those are in Boeing 747s. To get a sense of, and look, one of the advantages of freighters is that they're very keen, as I said, to maximise the payload opportunity, and that means that they're more flexible than passenger aircraft in terms of having a variation off the path. So for a movement out of Europe, there might be 2 or 3 different stops on the way to collect some more cargo, just depending. So the most popular destinations in Asia are Shanghai, Seoul, Beijing, and Hong Kong. So that just gives you a sense of the level of intensity of air cargo movements into Asia. And so, having another look back at our focus questions, what I've sought to cover today were the key trends in that first part of the lecture, international and domestic air cargo traffic. We then looked at the main international trade routes, and then we finished off with a look at the hubs and the role of the airport and some of the variations over the course of a year. Has anybody got any questions? Otherwise, thanks, and I will see you again soon.